Elliot Rivers woke up in a place he didn't recognize. His room, the small, cluttered apartment where he'd spent the last several months grinding away at lines of code, was gone. The faint hum of his desktop computer was missing, replaced by a strange, hollow quiet. Instead of the familiar beige walls and tattered furniture, he stood on a floating patch of ground surrounded by swirling colors, shifting shapes, and distorted geometric patterns. The air felt too still, the silence unsettling in its emptiness. Elliot blinked, rubbed his eyes, and looked around again. He had been coding all night, the glow of his computer screen the only companion in the small, dark apartment. Maybe he'd fallen asleep in front of the screen. Maybe this was a dream. But the vividness, the details, felt too real. His heart pounded in his chest. The world around him shimmered like a pixelated dreamscape, and yet there was something strangely familiar about it, like he had seen it before but never quite this way. He lifted a hand to feel his face, his skin. It felt human enough, warm, alive. He touched his neck, feeling the cold air brush against it. There were no windows here, no doors, only endless space and floating shapes that defied logic. "Where am I?" he muttered, looking around, hoping someone might answer. Then he saw her. At first, he thought she was a mirage, a product of his confused mind, making up some figure to cope with the bizarre situation. But as she stepped toward him, her form solidified. She looked like a person, but not quite like anyone he had ever seen. Her body was semi-transparent, glowing faintly, as if made from light itself. Her face was both familiar and strange, as though he'd seen her in his memories but couldn't quite place where. "Who are you?" Elliot asked, his voice shaking. The figure smiled, a soft, enigmatic smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I could ask you the same thing." Elliot took a step back. "What is this place? What's going on?" "You're in the virtual world, Elliot. Welcome to your mind." Elliot furrowed his brow, unsure if he was hallucinating. The figure could see his confusion, her smile growing a little more knowing. "I know. You think this is a dream. But it's not. It's real. Or at least, real enough for now." Elliot shook his head, trying to process what she was saying. "Virtual world? My mind?" The figure nodded. "I'm Zara. And I'm here to help you get out of this place." "Help me get out? What do you mean? I don't even know where I am." Zara's expression softened, and for the first time, there was something more human about her, a trace of empathy, maybe. "You're stuck in here, Elliot. And I'm here to guide you." "Guide me? You're not real." "Are you?" "I am real," she said, her voice firm, yet oddly gentle. "But so are you, in a way. We're both real here. At least for now." Elliot took another step back, looking around the shifting landscape. It felt like he was trapped in a dream, but it was too coherent for that. There was too much detail, too much purpose to it. Okay, this is too much. What do you want from me?" Zara's gaze sharpened. "I don't want anything from you, Elliot. You don't even know who I am, but you will. Eventually. That's the thing about time, it catches up with you." The air seemed to shift then, as if the world around them pulsed with an invisible force. Elliot's head swam as a strange sensation overcame him, as if a fog was lifting in his brain. Suddenly, he was aware of something deeper, something connected to Zara in a way he couldn't explain. She held out a hand to him, the glow from her form flickering as she did. "You've been here before, Elliot. This world, this place, it's part of you. It's time to find the way out. And I'm the key." He swallowed, torn between disbelief and a growing sense of urgency. "How? How do we leave?" "You don't leave this place until you understand why you're here," Zara answered. Her voice was matter-of-fact, like she had said this 1,000 times before. Elliot looked at her for a long moment. The surreal nature of the situation was beginning to wear on him, the unfamiliarity of the world pressing against his sanity. But despite the overwhelming sense of dislocation, something about Zara felt right. There was an intimacy to her, an underlying connection that he couldn't ignore. "You said I've been here before," he said slowly, "but how is that possible?" Zara's gaze softened. "You'll remember soon enough, Elliot. It's only a matter of time." He felt a sudden chill in the air, but it wasn't the temperature, it was something deeper, a growing unease, as if the ground he stood on was beginning to shift beneath him. Elliot and Zara traveled deeper into the virtual landscape, navigating a world that twisted and warped around them. They moved through shifting environments, forests made of glass, buildings that seemed to melt and reform with each passing moment, skies that turned from vibrant blue to a strange shade of purple in an instant. There were moments when it felt like they were walking through a dream, but at the same time, everything was too real to dismiss. Zara led the way, her presence both reassuring and unsettling. She spoke often, guiding him through the landscape, but her words were often cryptic, layered with meaning Elliot couldn't yet grasp. Sometimes she would point out strange objects or moments in the environment that seemed insignificant, only to reveal later that they held deeper meaning. "You can't see it yet," Zara would say, her eyes flicking toward something Elliot hadn't noticed. "But the answer is there." Elliot wanted to understand. He wanted to escape this place, return to the world he knew. But every time he thought he was close, the rules of the world would shift, and he'd be left feeling more lost than before. Then, one day, after what felt like an eternity of wandering, they came upon a structure. It was a tower, standing tall against the swirling sky, its surface smooth and reflective. It seemed to pulse with a strange energy, like a doorway into something beyond. Zara turned to him. "This is it, Elliot. The end of the road. Or the beginning. It depends on how you look at it." Elliot approached the tower cautiously, his heart beating faster. He could feel the pull of it, like a magnetic force drawing him in. But something about it felt wrong. It was too perfect. Too organized. A part of him wondered if he was walking into a trap. "You've been here before, haven't you?" he asked, turning to Zara. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, her expression tightened, as if she were fighting against something. "I know what you're thinking," she said finally. "But the truth is, we're both trapped here. The tower is a part of this place. And the only way to leave is to confront what's keeping us here." Elliot stared at her, confusion still clouding his mind. "What do you mean? What's keeping us here?" Zara's gaze softened again, and for the first time, she seemed vulnerable, like the ghost of a person struggling to remember who they were. "Me," she said simply. Elliot blinked. "What?" Zara stepped forward, her form flickering slightly. "I am you. Or, rather, I was you. A version of you. A future version of yourself, lost in time." Elliot's heart skipped a beat. You're me?" Her gaze met his, and in that instant, Elliot saw something beyond the digital veil, a flicker of understanding. "I'm the result of a choice you'll make. A mistake. And I'm stuck here, waiting for you to find the way out. You can't escape until you understand why I'm here. Why we're both here." Elliot stood frozen, the weight of her words crashing down on him. Everything around him seemed to blur, the landscape twisting into something far darker than before. Was it possible? Could Zara really be him? Before he could ask another question, the world around them started to shift. The tower began to distort, its surface rippling like water. And then, just as quickly, the space around them started to collapse. The tower's surface rippled as if it were made of liquid glass, bending and warping under some unseen force. Elliot instinctively stepped back, his breath catching in his throat. The world around them seemed to bend and fracture, as though reality itself were cracking apart at the seams. Shapes and colors collided in chaotic bursts, but somehow, everything still felt grounded, real. Too real. His skin prickled with the kind of tension he couldn't explain, and yet there was something comforting in Zara's presence. Even though she was beginning to fade, her glowing form flickering like a faulty light bulb. "What's happening?" Elliot asked, his voice tight with urgency. "This place doesn't want you to understand," Zara whispered, her voice trembling with an intensity that made Elliot's heart race. "It's protecting itself. Protecting you, from the truth." "Truth?" Elliot's mind spun. "What truth? What's happening to you?" "I'm becoming what I was supposed to be," Zara replied, her voice growing softer. "What you are going to become, unless you stop it." The colors around them swirled faster now, the environment distorting more violently, and Elliot felt a sharp tug at his consciousness, as though something was pulling him away from the here and now. The ground beneath his feet shuddered, and the air grew cold. He clutched his head, overwhelmed by an image that flashed in front of his eyes, a rapid-fire sequence of moments from his life, fragmented like the pieces of a shattered mirror, his childhood. His failures. His fears. The people he loved, and the ones he had lost. His time spent alone in front of a glowing computer screen, tapping away at lines of code, looking for meaning in the digital maze of his creation. The memories were so vivid, so real, it felt as though he were living them all over again, each one crashing against the other in a storm of emotion. "You're not just a ghost, are you?" Elliot said, his voice thick with understanding. "You're me. My future self." Zara's form flickered again, and this time, Elliot felt a jolt, like a snap in the fabric of his mind. Her expression was one of quiet resignation, as though she had been waiting for him to understand. "Yes," she said softly, her voice distant now, as if she were speaking from far away. "I am you. A version of you, lost in time, trapped here." Elliot staggered back, his pulse racing. He felt his knees go weak, as though the very ground he stood on was pulling him down. The weight of Zara's words settled heavily on his chest. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He could barely breathe, his mind struggling to catch up with the flood of revelation. How could this be happening? How could his future self, a version of himself, be trapped in this place, this virtual world? What had happened to her, to him? "I was supposed to prevent it," Zara continued, her voice barely a whisper now, as if her presence was beginning to dissolve entirely. "I tried, Elliot. I tried to fix what you couldn't see, but it was too late. I became what you will become if you don't change. If you don't stop what's coming." "Stop what?" Elliot asked, the desperation in his voice rising. "What happened? What am I supposed to do?" Zara's form flickered once more, almost vanishing before him, and then her eyes locked with his, clear and sharp. "The future isn't set in stone," she said, her words lingering in the air. "You still have a chance. You can still make the right choice, Elliot. But you have to face it. You have to face yourself." And then she was gone. Completely gone, the world around him crumbled, the landscape folding in on itself like paper burning at the edges. Elliot stood alone, his mind reeling. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his heart pounded in his chest. The environment continued to shift, but he barely noticed. The sense of vertigo he felt earlier was nothing compared to the emptiness inside him now, as if he had lost something crucial, something irreplaceable. But then, a flicker of understanding ignited within him. Zara, no, she wasn't gone. She couldn't be. Not really. She had just been a part of him that was lost, a future self locked away in this fractured world. And now, it was up to him to put everything back together. With a renewed sense of determination, Elliot turned, taking one last look at the collapsing landscape around him. The virtual world, which had felt like a prison, now seemed like a battleground, a place where his past and future had collided in a desperate attempt to break free. He couldn't escape until he confronted the truth, until he faced whatever had caused him to create this world in the first place. The next moment, the world snapped back into focus. Elliot found himself standing once again in the center of a vast, swirling sky. The colors were muted now, almost washed out, as if the life had been drained from the environment. The floating shapes that had once felt like the very fabric of the world seemed more like illusions now, shadows of something that had been. He looked down at his hands, feeling the texture of his skin, the faint tremble in his fingertips. He was real. This was real, and yet, it wasn't. The realization hit him all at once. This place wasn't just a dream. It was the product of his own mind. Every corner of this virtual world, every surreal detail, had been shaped by his thoughts, his fears, his unresolved regrets. This was his own inner prison, a manifestation of everything he had avoided, everything he had buried deep within himself. But now, it was time to face it. Elliot walked forward, his step steady but hesitant. He knew what he had to do now. He had to let go of the past, confront his mistakes, and make the choice that would free him from the cycle that had ensnared him. He wasn't just fighting for his future, he was fighting for the person he had once been. With every step, the world around him shifted, the colors and shapes melting away to reveal something new, a blank canvas, waiting to be filled. As he walked, memories flooded back. Faces, names, events, people he had loved and lost, moments he had wished to forget, but that had remained with him all along. The pain of his failures, the regret of his inaction. His mind had created this world as a way to hide from those feelings, to suppress the part of himself that feared failure more than anything else. But the more he walked, the more he understood. The only way out was through. He had to face everything, every regret, every mistake. Only then could he escape this place. Only then could he truly be free. Ahead of him, a door appeared, glowing softly. It was the first solid thing he had seen in what felt like hours. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and grasped the handle. The moment his fingers touched it, the door creaked open, and a rush of light poured through. Elliot stepped through. The next thing he knew, he was awake. He opened his eyes to find himself back in his apartment, his real apartment. The glow of his computer screen illuminated the room in the same familiar way it always had. The hum of the old tower PC filled the air, and outside his window, the sounds of the city drifted in. He was home, but something was different. Elliot sat up, his heart still racing, his mind reeling. He wasn't sure what had just happened. Had he been asleep this whole time? Was it all just a dream? But as his eyes scanned the room, he noticed something strange. The walls, the furniture, everything was exactly as it had been before. But the room felt heavier. He felt different. As if some part of him had been awakened, or reawakened, in ways he couldn't explain. He stood, a quiet determination settling over him. He had learned something during his time in that strange digital world. Something important. Zara, his future self, had given him the key to his own freedom. He had seen the truth, faced his own mistakes, and now, it was time to move forward. To make the choices that would lead him to a different future. Elliot turned away from the desk and walked toward the window, looking out at the city as the morning light filtered in. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it. Elliot stood by the window, staring out at the city below. The sun was beginning to rise, its light casting long shadows across the buildings, turning everything a soft shade of gold. The hum of the city, always present, seemed more alive now, somehow. He took a deep breath and let the cool morning air fill his lungs. For a moment, everything felt different. The weight of the world he had been living in, the virtual world, the mistakes, the regrets, seemed to lift slightly, as if it had no hold over him anymore. His mind raced with questions. Was he still in the real world? Had he truly returned? The transition had been too abrupt. One moment, he had stepped through that door, and the next, he was here. But was it really here? Was it real? Was the world he stood in the same one he'd left behind? He shook his head, feeling the dizziness of uncertainty. The idea that everything could be an illusion, a trick, was still too much for him to shake off. But the sense of freedom that filled him now was undeniable. It wasn't just the city outside, it was a shift inside himself. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt like he could breathe again. Like something had unlocked inside of him, a door that had been sealed for too long. And that was enough. He turned from the window, walking back toward his desk. The clutter, the familiar sight of his computer screen, nothing had changed on the surface. But it all felt lighter. He no longer felt trapped by the endless loops of code, the weight of failed projects, or the loneliness that had once defined his life. He realized, suddenly, that he hadn't checked his emails, hadn't read the notifications piling up in his inbox. For so long, they had been a source of anxiety, reminders of deadlines and unfinished work. But now, they seemed irrelevant. Like distractions. Instead, he sat down at his desk, turned on the computer, and began to type. He didn't know what he was going to do next. He didn't have a plan, didn't have some grand idea of what he was supposed to achieve. But for the first time in ages, it didn't matter. He was free. Not because the virtual world was gone, but because he had finally come to terms with it. With himself. A message popped up on his screen, interrupting his thoughts. "Welcome back, Elliot. I knew you'd get there eventually." His fingers froze over the keyboard. His breath caught in his chest. He read the message again. The words were familiar. Too familiar. His heart skipped a beat. Zara? His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he waited. The cursor blinked back at him, a silent reminder of the world beyond the screen. Could it be her? Could it be that simple? Was this still the same world? Was this some trick of his mind? Or was it really the answer he had been waiting for? The reply came almost immediately. "It's me." Elliot's pulse quickened. He leaned forward, staring at the screen, feeling both exhilarated and terrified at the same time. He was no longer sure what to think, what to believe. He had thought he had left her behind, had thought that when he stepped into the real world, everything would be over. But Zara, or whatever part of her this was still here. Was she part of the digital world? Part of the past? Or was she part of him, forever entwined with who he had been, who he was becoming? The message flashed again. "You're not done yet, Elliot. There's still more for you to do. Don't think you've escaped. Not yet." Elliot stared at the words. There was an urgency in them, a pressure that felt heavier than anything else. A pressure he couldn't ignore. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Escape? Had he really escaped? Or was Zara right? Had he only reached the surface of something much bigger, something he was still too blind to see? He closed his eyes, trying to clear his thoughts. He remembered the door he had stepped through in the virtual world, the way it had opened to him, like the first crack of light in a pitch-black room. The sensation of release. Of freedom. Of something that had been waiting for him all along, but had he left it behind? Had he truly left it all behind? The soft hum of his computer was the only sound in the room. He could hear the rhythm of his heartbeat, the slow, deliberate way his breath came in and out. There was a part of him that wanted to forget about Zara, about the digital world and the mistakes that had haunted him for so long. He could bury it all, pretend it never happened. He could move forward with his life and let the past be the past, but that wasn't who he was anymore. That wasn't the person he had become. He had faced his own future. And he had changed. Elliot's hands hovered over the keyboard, his mind made up. He wasn't done. Not yet. He typed quickly, his fingers flying across the keys. "What more is there?" The reply came in an instant. "There's always more, Elliot. The future is never truly set in stone. You have to make the right choices. And you have to keep going." Elliot closed his eyes again, letting the words sink in. He hadn't made all the right choices in his life. He knew that. But what mattered now was what he would do next. The world had given him another chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. Whatever was left to do, whatever steps he still needed to take, he would face them, and this time, he wouldn't be afraid. Not of the future. not of the past. That he hit enter. I'm ready. For a moment, there was silence. The screen stayed blank, the cursor blinking slowly, almost tauntingly, as if the world was holding its breath. But then, the next message appeared. Good. We'll begin again. The screen flickered for a moment, and Elliot felt a surge of something, a wave of energy, of certainty. He didn't know what would come next. He didn't know where this new path would lead him. But in that moment, he realized that the journey was far from over. And for the first time, he felt the excitement of it. The possibility of it. He stood up from his desk and walked toward the window, looking out at the city once again. The sky was brighter now, the streets below alive with motion. The world outside had never looked more full of potential. Whatever had happened to him, whatever this had all been, he had come through it. The past, the mistakes, the regrets, the fractured world of his mind, they were all still there. But they were no longer holding him back. Elliot took a deep breath, feeling the weight lift off his shoulders. He was ready for whatever was to come, and for the first time in years, he believed that the future was his to shape.